A spear entered a dying man's side on a hill outside Jerusalem. That is where the legend begins. Not with a throne, not with a crown, not with an army marching beneath imperial banners, with a Roman weapon used in an execution, touching the body of Christ. Centuries later, emperors would look at that weapon and see something far larger than iron. They saw permission. They saw destiny. They saw a sign that heaven itself had chosen who should rule on earth. But why would Europe's most powerful men believe that holding this spear meant holding the right to command empires? To understand that, we have to slow the story down, because the spear was never only a relic. It was never only an object locked behind glass, wrapped in gold, or carried through ceremonies by nervous hands. It became a bridge between violence and holiness, between battlefield victory and divine favor, between the Rome that crucified Christ and the Christian empire that later claimed to rule in his name. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Tonight, we follow one of the strangest political objects in European memory, the Holy Lance, often called the Spear of Destiny. Its story moves through scripture, legend, imperial ambition, medieval anxiety, and the deep human need to make power feel sacred. The evidence is uneven. The claims are contested. The relics themselves multiply in ways that should make any careful historian pause. And yet, that may be exactly why the spear mattered. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not the one that wounds the body. It is the one that convinces people a throne has been blessed. The story of the spear begins in a place where Rome wanted stories to end. Golgotha was not designed for mystery. It was not a shrine, not a royal stage, not a place where future emperors were meant to search for signs. It was a site of public execution, positioned to be seen, remembered, and feared. Crucifixion was not only a punishment, it was a message written on the body. Rome decides who lives, who dies, and who is made an example. In the Gospel of John, after Jesus has died on the cross, a soldier pierces his side with a spear. Blood and water flow out. The moment is brief, almost spare. There is no grand speech from the soldier, no lingering description of the weapon, no suggestion yet that this spear will one day be treated as a key to empire. The act is practical. It belongs to the machinery of execution. And that is what makes the later legend so striking. A tool of imperial violence becomes, over centuries, a sacred object. The weapon of an occupying power is drawn into the memory of the passion. The spear does not vanish after the wound. Instead, the Christian imagination begins to gather around it, slowly giving it a name, a wielder, and a meaning far beyond the original scene. That wielder becomes known as Longinus. But here, caution matters. Longinus does not appear by name in the biblical account. His identity belongs to later Christian tradition, which gradually shaped the unnamed Roman soldier into a figure with a story of his own. According to later accounts, he was the centurion or soldier who pierced Christ, and in some versions, came to recognize the truth of what he had witnessed. Over time, the man who carried out the act was transformed from an instrument of Rome into a witness of revelation. This transformation is important because it shows how relic legends often work. They do not simply preserve an event. They interpret it. They give emotional shape to what the text leaves stark and unfinished. For early Christians, the wound in Christ's side carried deep theological weight. It was not merely evidence of death. It became a sign of sacrifice, fulfillment, and salvation. Blood and water were read with layers of meaning. The reality of Christ's body, the mystery of redemption, the life of the church. The spear, then, was not powerful because it was a beautiful object. It was powerful because it touched the boundary between death and meaning. Still, we should not imagine that a glittering relic immediately appeared in the hands of bishops and kings. That would be too neat. The path from a line in Scripture to an imperial treasure was long, uneven, and tangled with devotion, politics, and memory. Sacred objects did not become powerful overnight. They became powerful because communities returned to them again and again, telling stories around them, building rituals near them, and placing them inside the larger drama of salvation. What began as an act within a Roman execution gradually became a point of contact with the divine. And that reversal is almost unsettling. Rome meant the cross to humiliate. Christianity made it holy. Rome meant the spear to confirm death. Christian tradition made it a witness. Rome used public violence to show control. The later church would turn the symbols of that violence into signs that earthly empires were not the highest authority after all. Yet the irony runs deeper, because once Christianity gained imperial power, the spear's meaning changed again. It no longer stood only as a reminder that Christ suffered under empire. It became something rulers could claim, display, and weave into their own authority. That is the strange life of the Holy Lance. Its story begins with a wound. But the legend did not remain with the wounded. It traveled into the hands of those who ruled, and in that journey, the spear became one of history's most revealing objects, a reminder that power often survives by changing the meaning of what it once feared. Long before Christian emperors looked for holiness in a spear, Rome had already taught the ancient world a hard lesson. Power does not travel by force alone. It travels by image. A Roman army on the move was not just a mass of men with armor and discipline. It was a walking theater of authority. Standards rose above the ranks. Eagles caught the light. Unit emblems marked identity, loyalty, and honor. The sound of marching feet mattered, but so did what appeared above those feet. Signs that told every village, every enemy scout, every nervous ally that Rome was not merely arriving. Rome was announcing itself. To modern eyes, an eagle standard may look like decoration. A ceremonial weapon may seem secondary to the real business of war. But Rome understood that symbols could hold an army together when fear began to spread. They could give soldiers something to defend that was larger than their own survival. They could make conquest feel organized, sanctioned, almost inevitable. The Roman eagle, especially, was not treated as a casual ornament. It stood for the legion's honor. Losing it in battle could become a disaster of memory, not simply a tactical defeat. The men might survive. The commanders might write explanations. But the symbol had been taken. And in a culture built on reputation, hierarchy, and public glory, that mattered. This is one of the keys to understanding why the later legend of the Holy Lance could become so politically useful. Medieval rulers did not invent the relationship between objects and authority from nothing. They inherited a world in which visible signs had long been used to make power believable. Rome had standards. Rome had triumphs. Rome had ceremonial processions in which victory was performed before the public. It had crowns, purple garments, fasces, eagles, and carefully staged appearances of command. The empire knew that people often believe power more deeply when they can see it carried, raised, kissed, guarded, or placed in the center of a ritual. A symbol simplifies power. That is part of its danger. An empire is complicated. It requires taxes, roads, violence, law, negotiation, fear, administration, and luck. But an eagle on a pole can make all of that feel like one thing. A crown can turn a contested ruler into an image of order. A relic can turn a political claim into a sacred story. Rome was exceptionally good at this compression. It could take the machinery of domination and give it a face. And because Rome's symbols were public, they created a shared language. Even those who hated Roman rule understood what its emblems meant. That is the grim brilliance of imperial imagery. A banner does not need affection to be effective. It only needs recognition. This is why the spear, later imagined as a sacred object of empire, fits so easily into the political imagination of Europe. It was a weapon, and Rome knew weapons. It was tied to a public execution, and Rome knew public punishment. It could be lifted, displayed, and guarded, and Rome knew how display could make authority feel real. But the spear also carried something Rome's older symbols did not. The eagle said, "Rome conquers." The spear, after its Christian transformation, could say, "Heaven permits." That shift changed everything. A Roman standard made soldiers feel part of an earthly order. A Christian relic could claim to connect that order to eternity. The object no longer represented only discipline, victory, or imperial identity. It suggested that the ruler holding it stood within a divine plan, or at least wanted others to believe he did. This is where we should resist a simple explanation. Medieval people were not foolish because they respected objects. They lived in a world where objects carried memory, oath, blessing, and danger. A sword might be inherited with a family's honor. A crown might embody the continuity of a kingdom. A saint's bone might represent the nearness of heaven. The material world was not mute. It spoke through signs. Rome had built one language of power from military symbols. Christian Europe would build another from relics. The Holy Lance stood at the crossing point of those two languages. It was both a weapon and a sacred trace. It belonged, in imagination, to the machinery of Roman violence, yet it also touched the central mystery of Christian salvation. That made it unusually adaptable. A ruler could look at it and see not only an artifact of the Passion, but a political instrument with ancient imperial grammar already built into it. No one had to explain to a post-Roman world that a raised object could command attention. Rome had already done that for centuries. The new question was what happened when the object being raised was no longer an eagle of conquest, but a spear believed to have touched the body of Christ. For the first generations of Christians, Rome was not a holy inheritance. It was the power that watched, arrested, judged, and sometimes killed. That memory did not disappear easily. The Christian story began on the edges of imperial authority, among people who had little reason to imagine that the machinery of Rome would one day carry crosses, build churches, and argue over relics. The earliest believers lived within an empire that could be indifferent at best and hostile at its worst. Their faith grew in houses, in small gatherings, in communities that depended less on monuments than on memory, teaching, and endurance. Then the political weather changed. When Christianity moved from a persecuted religion toward imperial favor, the transformation was not simply a matter of belief becoming legal. It changed the relationship between holiness and power. A faith once associated with martyrs, prisoners, and the executed Christ gradually entered palaces, councils, ceremonies, and imperial patronage. The empire did not just tolerate Christianity. Over time, it began to speak through Christian language. This is the turning point that made relics politically explosive. Objects connected to the Passion of Christ had always carried devotional power. They drew the believer toward the suffering of Jesus, toward the mystery of salvation, toward the physical reality of a faith that insisted God had entered history in a body. But once emperors and kings began to present themselves as defenders of Christianity, those same objects acquired another layer. They could now help explain why a ruler's authority mattered in sacred terms. A relic could comfort the faithful. It could also authorize the powerful. This did not happen because everyone cynically decided to use religion as theater. That would be too modern and too flat. Many rulers were sincere believers. Many churchmen genuinely believed that sacred objects mediated divine presence and protection. Medieval and late antique people did not neatly separate politics, worship, public order, and cosmic meaning the way modern institutions often try to do. A victory in battle, a plague, a royal birth, a failed harvest, a comet in the sky. All of these could be read as signs within a moral universe. So when imperial Christianity grew, the old Roman habit of visible authority met a new Christian world of sacred matter. The result was powerful. A cross could be carried before armies. A church could be built where imperial memory needed anchoring. A relic could make a ruler appear not merely successful, but chosen for a role in the defense of the faith. In this world, objects mattered because they gave spiritual texture to political claims. They made invisible approval feel visible. The Passion relics were especially potent because they were tied not to a distant saint or local miracle, but to the central event of Christian salvation. The cross, the nails, the crown of thorns, the spear. These were not ordinary devotional objects in the imagination of believers. They belonged to the moment when divine suffering, human violence, and redemption met. That gave them an authority no royal genealogy could quite match. A bloodline could be disputed. A battlefield victory could be temporary. A treaty could be broken. But a relic connected to Christ's passion seemed to stand above the instability of politics. It suggested continuity with a sacred event that no rival king could simply outvote or outfight. Of course, the evidence for many relics was often uncertain, and the stories surrounding them could grow more elaborate with time. But uncertainty did not necessarily weaken them in the medieval mind. Sometimes it did the opposite. A relic's power lay not only in documentation, but in tradition, ritual, recognition, and the community willing to treat it as real. This is uncomfortable for modern viewers because we often want a clear verdict, authentic or false, fact or fraud. But the political life of a relic worked in a different register. What mattered was not only whether the object could be proven to come from the 1st century. What mattered was whether enough people believed it connected the present to sacred history. Belief created public consequences. When the empire became Christian, the spear's story became possible in a new way. It could now be read not only as the weapon that pierced Christ, but as a sign that imperial violence itself had been overturned, absorbed, and redirected into Christian authority. The empire that once crucified now claimed to protect the crucified. There is a deep contradiction here, and it never fully disappears. Christianity remembered a savior executed by imperial power. Christian emperors then used the symbols of that execution to support imperial rule. The cross became a standard. The spear became a relic. The wounds of Christ became part of the language of kings. That contradiction may be one reason the story survived. It held together things that should have remained separate: humiliation and glory, suffering and command, empire and salvation. And once those things were joined, later rulers would inherit an extraordinary idea. To possess the right sacred object was not merely to own the past. It was to claim that the past had chosen you. The Western Roman Empire did not end in one clean moment. No bell rang across Europe announcing that the old world had fallen. No single morning arrived when everyone looked around and agreed that Rome was gone. Instead, imperial authority thinned, cracked, shifted, and survived in fragments. Armies changed loyalty, cities adapted, local powers learned to govern without waiting for instructions from distant emperors. The name of Rome remained powerful even when the structures behind it no longer commanded the same obedience. That is part of what made the centuries after Rome so unstable and so imaginative. New kingdoms rose in the old imperial landscape. Their rulers inherited Roman roads, Roman cities, Roman laws, Roman memories, and Christian bishops who often understood continuity better than the kings did. A ruler could control land and still feel politically incomplete. He might command warriors, collect tribute, and defeat rivals, but the shadow of Rome still asked a larger question. By what right do you rule? Bloodline helped, victory helped, alliance helped. But none of these fully replaced the old imperial idea that power could be universal, ordered, and sanctioned by something greater than personal strength. This is where sacred objects became so valuable. In a broken political world, a relic could promise continuity. It could suggest that the new ruler was not merely a successful warlord standing amid ruins, but part of a sacred chain. The relic did not need to explain every legal claim. It worked on a deeper level. It made authority feel inherited, blessed, and connected to a story people already recognized. The spear, as an idea, was perfectly suited for such a world. It linked three forces that post-Roman rulers desperately wanted to hold together: the memory of Rome, the power of Christianity, and the legitimacy of kingship. It was Roman because the original act belonged to a Roman execution. It was Christian because the wound belonged to the passion. It was royal because later rulers could present its possession as a sign that heaven had placed the burden of rule into their hands. The physical object mattered, of course. Medieval devotion was not abstract. People wanted to see, touch, process around, and guard holy things. But the spear's greater survival was not only material, it survived as a political possibility. A ruler did not simply need a weapon. He needed a weapon with a story strong enough to make conquest sound like inheritance. That difference matters. Many kings possessed swords. Many armies carried lances. Iron was not rare. What made the Holy Lance different was the claim attached to it. The weapon had supposedly entered the central drama of salvation. It had touched the body of Christ. If such an object could be placed near a throne, It did not merely decorate power. It transformed the atmosphere around power. It made kingship feel older than the king. The decline of Western Rome created a hunger for signs that could organize the confusion. People living through political fragmentation did not necessarily think of themselves as living in a dark age, a phrase later centuries would use too carelessly. They lived among continuities as well as disruptions. Churches remained. Latin remained. Roman titles remained. Imperial dreams remained. But the question of who could claim them became increasingly urgent. The spear belonged to that urgency. It offered a kind of symbolic repair. Where institutions had weakened, the relic could imply that sacred history still held the world together. Where royal families fought and borders changed, the relic could suggest a deeper order beneath the violence. Where new kingdoms worried about appearing temporary, the relic pointed back to the one name that still carried overwhelming prestige: Rome. Yet there is a quiet irony here. The spear's legend depended on an empire that had once executed Christ, but its later political power depended on rulers wanting to inherit Rome's dignity. The same imperial world that supplied the executioner also supplied the model of authority. Medieval Europe did not simply reject Rome. It argued over who had the right to continue it. That argument would shape the future, because once a king could claim both the Christian sacred past and the Roman imperial past, he was no longer presenting himself as one strong ruler among many. He was reaching for a larger identity: protector of Christendom, heir to empire, guardian of a divinely ordered world. The spear outlived Rome because Rome itself outlived its own collapse as an idea. It survived in law, in ceremony, in language, in ruins, in church politics, and in the imagination of kings who wanted their rule to feel inevitable. The Holy Lance entered that imagination not as a simple archaeological object, but as a solution to a political problem. How does a new ruler persuade people that his new power is not new at all? He finds an old symbol. He gives it a sacred wound. And then he lets the story do what armies cannot. By the time Charlemagne entered the story, Europe was no longer waiting for Rome to return in its old form. That world was gone. The legions were not marching back from the past. The Senate would not rise again as it had been. The old imperial administration of the West had broken into memories, titles, habits, ruins, and ambitions. Yet the idea of empire remained strangely alive, like an old fire buried under ash. It did not warm every hand, but rulers could still see its glow. Charlemagne understood the value of that glow. He was not merely a warrior king accumulating territory, although he certainly did that with brutal effectiveness. He was also a ruler trying to give shape to a vast and difficult realm. Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Aquitanians, Bavarians, and others who did not automatically feel like one people under one sacred order. Military conquest could expand borders. It could force obedience. But conquest alone could not create a durable imagination of unity. For that, Charlemagne needed more than victory. He needed meaning. The ambition to rebuild a Christian empire in Western Europe required a language that ordinary power could not supply. It needed signs that could speak across regions, peoples, and social ranks. It needed bishops and monasteries, law and learning, ceremony and memory. It needed the sense that this new order was not just Charlemagne's personal success, but part of a divine arrangement. This is where the story of imperial symbols becomes essential. A king can win a battlefield and still remain, in the eyes of rivals, only a king. But an emperor claims something larger. He claims responsibility for order itself. He becomes, at least in theory, the earthly guardian of a Christian civilization. That claim is enormous, and because it is enormous, it requires support from every available direction. Military triumph, papal recognition, inherited tradition, sacred ritual, and objects that seem to carry the weight of heaven. Charlemagne's world was full of such symbolic needs. The ruler had to appear as a defender of the church, a giver of law, a patron of learning, and a sword against pagan enemies. His authority was performed in councils, campaigns, royal courts, religious reforms, and ceremonies that turned political command into something more solemn. The spear belongs in this atmosphere, even when the evidence for direct possession in Charlemagne's own hands is wrapped in later tradition and imperial memory. This is important to say carefully. The legends that connect great rulers to the Holy Lance often tell us as much about later political imagination as they do about the rulers themselves. Medieval memory loved to arrange the past into meaningful chains. If an object later became central to imperial identity, it was tempting to place it in the hands of the greatest emperor of the early Middle Ages. And Charlemagne was the obvious figure. He had the scale. He had the victories. He had the Christian mission. He had the coronation that allowed later generations to imagine the Roman Empire reborn in the West. Whether every later association with the spear can be proven is less important than why those associations felt plausible. Charlemagne became the kind of ruler a relic wanted, or perhaps more accurately, he became the kind of ruler later centuries wanted a relic to have chosen. There is a subtle difference. A relic attached to a minor king might remain a local treasure. A relic attached to Charlemagne becomes part of the architecture of Europe's political imagination. It suggests that empire was not an accident of conquest, but a vocation. It frames war not only as expansion, but as defense of sacred order. It allows the ruler's violence to be narrated as service, his victories as signs, his crown as more than gold and ceremony. This does not make the story comfortable. Charlemagne's Christian empire was built through both reform and force. The same ruler who supported learning and church organization also waged relentless wars. Medieval kingship often lived inside that contradiction. Faith and violence were not kept in separate rooms. They sat at the same table, blessed by the same language, and sometimes carried on the same campaign. A symbol like the spear could make that contradiction easier to bear. It joined weapon and holiness in a single image. It suggested that the ruler's sword arm did not stand outside the sacred story, but inside it. For an empire trying to unite war, kingship, and faith, few symbols could be more useful. And this is why Charlemagne matters in the history of the Holy Lance. Even beyond the question of physical possession, he represents the moment when Western Europe once again imagined empire as a Christian destiny. After him, kings and emperors did not simply compete for land. They competed for the right to inherit his mission. The spear, whether in hand, treasury, or legend, became part of that inheritance. It was not enough for a ruler to say, "I have conquered." He had to say, "I have been entrusted." That is the difference between a warlord and an emperor. And in medieval Europe, the difference often depended on whether people believed heaven had left a sign. A crown is never just metal. It may be made of gold, set with stones, shaped by a master's hand, and placed carefully upon a ruler's head. But none of that is enough. A crown only works when people agree that it means something. Without belief, it is an expensive circle. With belief, it becomes a visible argument. This person stands above others, not merely because he has seized power, but because power has settled on him in a form the world must recognize. Medieval kings understood this deeply. Their authority rested on many things at once: birth, conquest, marriage, oath, inheritance, wealth, loyalty, and force. But those things were rarely as stable as rulers wished. Bloodlines could be challenged. Brothers could become enemies. Nobles could change sides with impressive moral flexibility. Armies could lose. Even a coronation could be disputed if the wrong people refused to accept it. So kingship needed reinforcement. It needed sacred signs. This does not mean medieval people believed every ruler was holy in a simple or sentimental way. They could be quite practical about power, and no one living near a royal court needed a lecture on ambition. But the office of kingship carried a religious meaning that modern politics often struggles to understand. A king was not just a successful administrator with better clothes. He was expected to defend the church, maintain justice, protect the weak in theory, punish disorder in practice, and stand as a kind of hinge between the earthly realm and the divine order. That role needed ceremony. It needed anointing. It needed oaths. It needed bishops. It needed prayers spoken in public, where the invisible could be given a visible shape. And where possible, it needed relics. Relics helped solve a political problem that armies could not solve by themselves. They made authority feel chosen rather than merely imposed. A king who stood near the bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, or objects associated with Christ's passion, was not simply decorating his rule with holy antiques. He was placing his kingship inside a sacred geography. He was saying, without always needing to say it aloud, that his power belonged within the same moral universe as martyrdom, salvation, and divine judgment. The spear fit into this system with unusual force. It was not gentle. It was not domestic. It was not the relic of a quiet chapel saint whose holiness came through withdrawal from the world. It was a weapon. Its meaning was formed at the intersection of violence, sacrifice, and authority. For rulers who lived by war but needed their wars to be morally legible, that mattered. A crown told people who ruled. A spear could suggest why he had the right to rule. That is a dangerous suggestion, and it should make us pause, because once power is framed as sacred, opposition can begin to look like rebellion not only against a ruler, but against heaven's order. This is one reason relics were so politically useful. They did not need to issue commands. They altered the atmosphere in which commands were heard. Imagine a ruler entering a public ceremony surrounded by bishops, nobles, soldiers, incense, chant, and sacred objects. The point was not simply to impress the crowd, although it certainly did that. The point was to make rule feel inevitable. Everything in the room told the same story from a different angle. The throne is old, the faith is ancient, the ruler is legitimate, and the order being displayed is not a temporary arrangement among ambitious men. The Holy Lance could stand within that story as a concentrated sign of sacred force. It was not the only relic that mattered, and it would be misleading to isolate it from the wider world of medieval devotion. Its political power came partly from being one object among many in a system of signs. The cross, the nails, the bodies of saints, royal regalia, blessed banners, coronation oils, liturgical books. All of these helped build an atmosphere in which kingship could be experienced as more than government. But the spear had a particular edge. Unlike a crown, it did not merely rest above the ruler. Unlike a book, it did not simply authorize through law or prayer. Unlike a bone relic, it did not point only to sanctity endured. It pointed to the wound at the center of Christian memory, and it did so through the form of a weapon. That made it unusually useful for kings who needed to reconcile two facts. They ruled through force, and they wanted that force to appear blessed. The medieval mind did not always experience this as hypocrisy. It often experienced it as order. Violence could be sinful, but it could also be framed as justice, defense, punishment, or holy duty. The same object that reminded believers of Christ's suffering could be used to suggest that a ruler's violence served a divine purpose. The contradiction did not disappear. It was ritualized. This is what sacred kingship often does. It does not remove politics from power. It surrounds politics with symbols strong enough to make them feel eternal. And that is why a crown needed more than gold. Gold could shine. Bloodline could explain descent. Victory could create fear. But relics gave kingship a deeper grammar. They allowed rulers to speak in the language of providence, to claim not just success, but selection. For the people watching, the question was rarely asked in modern terms. Is this object authentic, and can we prove it beyond doubt? The more immediate question was often simpler and more powerful. Does this object make the king look chosen? If the answer was yes, the relic had already begun its work. A relic does not become powerful by sitting still. It has to move through the world. It has to be shown at the right moment, guarded by the right people, placed near the right altar, carried before the right army, and remembered in the right story afterward. Its power grows not only from what it is believed to be, but from what is repeatedly done with it. That is why the Holy Lance should not be imagined only as a mysterious object locked away in a treasury. In political terms, it functioned more like a machine, not a machine of gears and wheels, but of ceremony, memory, fear, and repetition. First, the relic had to be seen. Visibility mattered. A sacred object hidden forever might remain holy to a few, but it could not easily shape public imagination. The display of a relic created a shared experience. People gathered, clergy interpreted, rulers stood close to it. Soldiers heard that it had accompanied victory. Nobles watched who was allowed to touch it, who was allowed to carry it, who was allowed to claim its protection. Access became hierarchy. The closer one stood to the relic, the closer one appeared to sacred authority. Then the story had to be repeated. This is where legend does its work. A relic's meaning grows stronger when it is tied to decisive moments. A battle won after the relic was present. A ruler protected while carrying it. A dynasty blessed by its custody. A rival weakened by lacking it. The details might shift with retelling, but the political message became clearer each time. This object is not passive. It chooses, protects, judges, and confirms. Whether the relic truly changed the outcome of a battle is not the only question. In many cases, it may not even be the most useful question. What matters historically is that people acted as though it could. That belief could shape morale before battle, interpretation after battle, and legitimacy long after the dead were buried. A victory without a relic was military success. A victory with a relic could become evidence. This is the subtle brilliance of sacred politics. It turns events into signs. If a king wins while associated with the Holy Lance, the victory can be read as divine approval. If he loses, explanations may still be found. Sin, improper reverence, betrayal, God's testing, or the inscrutable will of heaven. The relic is protected from simple failure because the interpretive system around it is flexible. That flexibility made sacred symbols remarkably durable. The relic also needed ritual. Ritual is repetition with authority. It trains the eyes and the emotions. It tells people where to stand, when to bow, when to be silent, when to look. In a world where many people could not read official documents, ritual made political theology visible. It did not ask the crowd to study legitimacy. It allowed them to feel it. A ruler near the spear could appear as more than a man with armed supporters. He became part of a performance in which heaven, history, and empire seemed to meet. The relic was not making an argument in words. It was staging one. This is why relics could do something that legal charters and battlefield reports could not. They compressed a complicated claim into a single image. Here is the ruler. Here is the sacred object. Here is the church recognizing the moment. Here are the nobles watching. Here is the crowd remembering. A political machine has begun to turn. And like any machine of power, it needed maintenance. The story had to be protected. Doubts had to be managed. Rival claims had to be answered or ignored. The object had to be preserved, repaired, embellished, encased, inventoried, and placed within a setting worthy of its reputation. Gold and jewels were not merely decoration. They were visual arguments that the relic deserved reverence. A plain piece of old metal could be holy, but a plain piece of old metal wrapped in imperial ceremony could become almost impossible to see plainly. That is one of the hardest things for us to recover now. We look backward with museum habits. We want labels, dates, provenance, material analysis, and careful separation between artifact and interpretation. Medieval viewers often encountered relics inside a thick atmosphere of chant, incense, procession, fasting, preaching, rumor, and expectation. The object was never only itself. It arrived already surrounded by meaning. This does not mean everyone believed equally. Skepticism existed. Rival churches questioned rival relics. Political enemies understood propaganda when they saw it. Medieval people were capable of doubt, negotiation, and sharp intelligence. But public doubt was not always stronger than public ritual. A whispered suspicion could be overwhelmed by a royal procession. The Holy Lance's political usefulness depended on that imbalance. It did not need to convince every mind in private. It needed to shape what could be said and believed in public. This is how symbols govern, not by proving themselves beyond dispute, but by becoming difficult to oppose without seeming to oppose the world they represent. If the spear stood for Christ's passion, imperial inheritance, divine favor, and victorious kingship, then challenging the ruler who possessed it could be made to feel larger than ordinary rebellion. The opponent was not merely questioning a man. He was stepping into a story where heaven might already have taken sides. That was the machine. Display created awe. Legend created memory. Ritual created legitimacy. Victory created proof. Fear created obedience. And once the machine was running, the physical spearhead was only one part of it. The larger power lived in the system built around it. The priests who blessed it. The rulers who claimed it. The chroniclers who placed it inside history. And the people who learned to see in it the shape of destiny. A relic may begin as an object, but in the hands of empire, it becomes a method. The Holy Lance has a problem that many famous relics share. There is more than one. For a modern viewer, this may sound like the moment when the whole story collapses. If several places claim to possess the spear that pierced Christ, then surely most of them, perhaps all of them, must be mistaken. That is a reasonable instinct. But it is not enough to explain why the claims mattered, or why they survived. Relics did not live only in the world of physical evidence. They lived in the world of devotion, prestige, rivalry, and sacred geography. A city that claimed a major relic was not merely saying, "We have an object." It was saying, "We belong near the center of Christian history." A church that guarded such a relic became more than a building. It became a destination, a treasury of memory, a place where heaven seemed to have left a trace. So when different traditions pointed to different holy lances, the disagreement was not just archaeological, it was political. In the Eastern Christian world, stories of the lance circulated within the sacred landscape of Jerusalem, Constantinople, and the great centers of Imperial Christianity. In the West, the lance became tied to the ambitions of rulers who wanted to connect themselves to Rome, Christ, and the authority of empire. Later medieval Europe would see claims attached to particular treasuries and dynasties, each carrying its own logic, its own audience, its own reason for wanting the story to be true. This multiplication may seem suspicious. In one sense, it is. A careful historian cannot simply accept every claim because it is wrapped in devotion. The evidence is uneven, and the chain from the crucifixion to medieval treasuries is often interrupted by silence, legend, or later reconstruction. Sacred stories tend to become clearer as they move further from the event, which is exactly the opposite of what historians prefer. But there is another way to read the problem. The many faces of the Holy Lance reveal how valuable the idea had become. No one fights to possess a meaningless story. No empire builds prestige around an object nobody cares about. No city promotes a relic unless the relic can draw attention, authority, pilgrims, gifts, and memory. Competing lances are evidence not only of uncertainty, but of desire. They show that Christian power centers understood the symbolic force of owning the wound. That phrase sounds strange, but it is close to the truth. To claim the lance was to claim proximity to the passion. It meant that your church, your city, your ruler, or your empire stood close to the moment when salvation entered history through suffering. The relic created a kind of sacred address. It located universal Christian memory in a specific place, under specific guardianship. That could change the status of a city. It could change the aura of a dynasty. It could make one treasury feel like the heir of another. And this is why rival claims did not necessarily cancel each other out in practice. They competed across different audiences and contexts. A pilgrim in one region might venerate one lance. An imperial court might honor another. A chronicler might connect a ruler to a relic not because he had verified every link in the chain, but because the association made sense inside the political theology of his world. The story was doing work. It was organizing loyalty. It was explaining rank. It was turning possession into destiny. There is also a human dimension here that should not be missed. Medieval Christians longed for closeness to sacred history. The events of the Passion were not remote episodes filed away in a book. They were reenacted in liturgy, contemplated in prayer, painted on church walls, sung, preached, and carried into ordinary fear and hope. A relic promised that the distance between then and now could be narrowed. The spear, especially, narrowed that distance with unsettling directness. It was not a symbol of Christ's teaching, but of his wounded body. It was physical, sharp, and morally complicated. It forced believers to remember that salvation, in Christian imagination, passed through state violence, public humiliation, and death. Yet rulers were drawn to it, precisely because it converted that violence into authority. Each claimed lance carried a slightly different emphasis. In one place, the relic might stand for the memory of Jerusalem. In another, the grandeur of Constantinople. In another, the imperial identity of Western Europe. The object's meaning shifted depending on who held it, who displayed it, and what story they needed it to tell. That flexibility made it powerful. It also made it vulnerable. Because the more a relic served political needs, the harder it became to separate devotion from ambition. A ruler might sincerely revere the lance and still benefit from its public display. A church might honestly preserve a tradition and still understand the prestige that came with it. A city might defend its relic with theological seriousness while also knowing that pilgrims were good for reputation and economy. Sacred history and worldly advantage were not always enemies. Often, they walked together. The many holy lances remind us that authenticity was not the only kind of truth medieval people sought. They wanted contact, continuity, assurance. They wanted signs that their world, fractured by war and succession, still touched the divine story. When rival centers claimed the spear, they were competing for more than an artifact. They were competing for the right to make the sacred past present. For us, the multiplication of relics may raise doubts. For them, it raised stakes. Because if the lance could prove that heaven favored a ruler, then the question of who possessed it was never a minor devotional dispute. It was a struggle over legitimacy itself. And so the Holy Lance did not have one face. It had many. Eastern, Western, devotional, imperial, local, universal, fragile, commanding. Each face tells us less about a single piece of iron than about the worlds that needed it. Worlds where power was never satisfied with being strong. It wanted to be sacred. In the Holy Roman Empire, the spear found one of its most powerful stages. Not the hill of Golgotha, not the early Christian imagination, not the broad symbolic world of Rome. A treasury. That may sound less dramatic at first. A treasury suggests storage, inventory, careful custody. But an imperial treasury was not a closet for expensive things. It was a political memory chamber. Crowns, swords, crosses, robes, reliquaries, and ceremonial objects did not sit there as isolated possessions. Together, they formed a material argument about authority. The spear, preserved among the imperial regalia of the Holy Roman Empire, became known as one of the great signs of imperial legitimacy. It was associated with German kings and emperors, and over time it gathered layers of meaning that connected rulership, Christian mission, and Roman inheritance. To stand near it was not simply to stand near an old weapon. It was to stand near a story about what an emperor was supposed to be. This is where the word imperial matters. A king rules a kingdom. An emperor claims a wider horizon. He does not merely govern land. He represents an order that reaches beyond local borders. In the medieval West, the Holy Roman Emperor was imagined, at least in theory, as heir to Rome and protector of Christendom. The reality was messier, of course. The empire was a shifting political organism made of princes, bishops, cities, rival interests, and repeated conflicts. But the ideal remained enormous, and enormous ideals need objects. The Imperial Spear helped make that ideal visible. It suggested that the emperor's authority was not newly invented, not merely German, not simply the result of noble bargaining or military pressure. It reached backward toward Rome and upward toward heaven. That double movement was the secret of its power. Backward to empire, upward to God. The spear's association with the Passion allowed imperial rule to be framed as sacred duty. Its association with Roman violence gave it an older, harsher grammar of command. It could be read as the weapon that once proved Christ's death, now transformed into a sign that Christian empire had inherited history's burden. In the hands of medieval rulers, this was not a small claim. It implied that the emperor did not merely possess territory, he carried a mission. This is why the spear could not be understood as a private devotional object alone. It belonged to public power. It belonged to the stage on which kings became emperors, and rule was dressed in the language of salvation. It helped answer a question that haunted the medieval empire. Why should this ruler, among so many ambitious lords, be seen as more than first among rivals? The answer was never one thing. It came from election, coronation, papal politics, noble consent, dynastic strength, and military ability. But symbols like the spear gave the answer emotional weight. They turned legal and political arrangements into something that felt ancient, sacred, and almost inevitable. That feeling mattered because the Holy Roman Empire was often less solid than its name suggested. Its rulers could be powerful, but their power depended on negotiation. Their authority could be challenged by princes, popes, cities, and rival claimants. The empire's sacred language was not an ornament placed on top of secure power. It was often a way of stabilizing power that was, in practice, always being contested. The spear helped create continuity where politics created interruption. A ruler died. A succession dispute began. A new king was chosen. Alliances shifted, but the regalia remained. The spear remained. The objects seemed to outlast the anxieties of any single reign. They whispered, in their own metallic language, that the office was greater than the man. This is one of the most important functions of imperial regalia. It separates authority from the fragile body of the ruler. A king can age, fail, sin, lose battles, and die. But the crown, the sword, the cross, and the spear appear to carry the dignity of rulership across generations. They make the state look older than its current crisis. In this sense, the imperial spear was not only a relic of the Passion, it was a relic of continuity. It helped tell a story in which Rome had not truly ended, but had been baptized, transformed, and handed onward. The ancient empire of Augustus and Constantine became, in medieval imagination, part of a sacred succession. The Christian emperor did not see himself as copying Rome in a shallow way. He was claiming to continue its universal mission under the sign of Christ. Whether that claim matched political reality is another matter. Much of medieval imperial history is a long argument between ideal and fact. The ideal spoke of unity. The facts produced fragmentation. The ideal spoke of sacred order. The facts included civil war, papal conflict, local rebellion, and rulers with very human appetites. But precisely because the facts were unstable, the symbols had to be strong. The Imperial Spear was strong because it condensed contradiction into a single object. It was a weapon tied to a victim, a Roman instrument claimed by Christian rulers, a relic of suffering used to support command, a sign of death turned into a sign of legitimacy. That should make us careful. The spear did not simply prove imperial authority, it helped narrate it. It gave rulers a way to present their power as part of a sacred inheritance, and it gave subjects a way to imagine political order as something more than force. But narration is not weakness. Narration is one of the ways power survives. A ruler who controls soldiers may win obedience for a season. A ruler who controls symbols may shape memory. And in the imperial treasury, among the objects that made rule visible, the spear stood as one of the most charged symbols of all. It did not need to speak. It only needed to be present, guarded, displayed, and believed. Because the emperor who held it could appear to hold more than iron. He could appear to hold the mission of Rome itself. The spear did not stand alone. That is one of the easiest things to miss when its legend is told, as if a single weapon carried the whole weight of empire by itself. In reality, the Holy Lance gained much of its force from the company it kept. It belonged to a wider sacred system built around the Passion of Christ. The cross, the nails, the crown of thorns, and the many fragments and objects believed to connect the medieval world to the final hours of Jesus. Together, these relics formed something larger than a collection. They formed a sacred map of suffering. Each object pointed to one part of the Passion: the cross to execution and redemption, the nails to the physical fastening of the body, the crown to mockery turned into kingship, the spear to the wound that confirmed death and in later interpretation opened a mystery of blood, water, and salvation. None of these objects needed to tell the whole story alone. Their power increased when they were placed beside one another, physically or imaginatively, as pieces of a single divine drama. For a ruler, this mattered enormously. A spear by itself might be interpreted as military force. A crown by itself might be read as royal status. But when the spear was understood alongside the nails, the cross, and the crown of Christ, its meaning changed. It no longer appeared merely as a weapon. It became one instrument in the story through which Christian salvation had been accomplished. That association made it far more dangerous politically, because it allowed earthly kingship to borrow from the language of Christ's suffering kingship. The crown of thorns was especially powerful in this regard. It was a mock crown, a sign of humiliation placed on Jesus by those who wanted to ridicule his claim to kingship. Yet Christian tradition reversed the insult. The mocked king became the true king. The crown of pain became a sign of victory over worldly violence. Medieval rulers could not simply claim to be Christ, of course. That would have been theological madness, and usually political foolishness as well. But they could place their own authority near the symbols of Christ's passion. They could allow proximity to do what direct speech could not. Near the crown, the king's crown seemed less ordinary. Near the nails, the ruler's duty seemed bound to sacrifice. Near the cross, victory could be described as service to the faith. Near the spear, the violence of rule could be wrapped in the memory of holy suffering. This is how relic systems work. One object explains another. A fragment of the true cross did not need to be large to matter. Its smallness could even heighten the sense of preciousness. A nail did not need to appear impressive by ordinary standards. Its story supplied the magnitude. The crown, whether preserved as an object or invoked through devotion, carried an emotional charge that no royal jewel could equal. The Passion relics did not compete with royal regalia. They transformed the meaning of regalia by standing near it. This is why imperial and royal treasuries often feel strange to modern eyes. They mix categories we are trained to keep apart. Weapon, jewel, relic, garment, legal symbol, liturgical object, political tool. But medieval power did not treat those categories as sealed compartments. A sword could be ceremonial and military. A crown could be decorative and sacramental in atmosphere. A relic could be devotional and political. A treasury could be both a storehouse and a theology of rule. The spear's power became stronger inside this arrangement, because it was no longer a lonely claim. It was supported by a whole vocabulary of sacred objects. Imagine the effect. A ruler presents himself not merely with soldiers and nobles, but with signs of the passion nearby. The message is not crude. It does not have to say, "God supports me," in plain language. It lets the objects speak in chorus. The cross says redemption stands behind this order. The nails say suffering has meaning. The crown says humiliation can conceal kingship. The spear says even death's confirmation can become testimony. Together, they make rule feel woven into salvation history, and yet the contradiction remains. The Passion was, at its heart, a story of the innocent suffering under worldly power. When kings used Passion relics to strengthen worldly power, they were entering dangerous symbolic territory. The relics could humble a ruler by reminding him that Christ's kingship was not like earthly domination, but they could also elevate him by suggesting that his authority participated in a divine mission. The same object could restrain power and glorify it. That double meaning is part of why these relics endured. They could speak to monks and soldiers, bishops and emperors, pilgrims and political advisors. A pilgrim might kneel before a Passion relic in grief and devotion. A ruler might stand near it as part of imperial display. Both reactions could exist around the same object, sometimes sincerely, sometimes uneasily. The medieval world did not always experience this as contradiction. It often experienced it as fullness. Sacred objects were allowed to carry more than one meaning at once. For the Church, Passion relics could focus devotion on Christ's sacrifice. For rulers, they could imply that political authority was accountable to God. For ambitious courts, they could also suggest that their ruler had a special place in the divine order. The line between humility and propaganda was not always clear, and perhaps it was not meant to be. That uncertainty gave the system its power. The spear was sharpened by the presence of the cross. The nails deepened the meaning of the wound. The crown turned humiliation into royal theology. Around these objects, Kingship could be imagined as more than inheritance, and empire as more than conquest. It could be staged as participation in the sacred story at the center of Christian belief. A modern historian may ask which objects were authentic, which claims were late, which traditions can be traced, and where the evidence breaks. Those questions are necessary. Without them, we become too easy to impress. But another question matters as well. What did these objects allow people to believe? They allowed medieval Europe to imagine that salvation and domination could occupy the same room, that a relic of suffering could bless a throne, that a ruler surrounded by sacred fragments was not only managing territory, but guarding a world ordered by heaven. The spear alone was compelling. The spear among the nails, the cross, and the crown became part of a complete political theology. And once power learned to surround itself with the instruments of Christ's passion, it no longer needed to look merely strong. It could look redeemed. A relic on a battlefield does not need to swing a sword. It works before the first blow lands. It works in the camp, where soldiers look for signs that they will survive the morning. It works in the rumors moving between tents, in the prayers before combat, in the way commanders speak of protection and destiny. It works in the enemy's imagination, too, if the story has traveled far enough. A sacred weapon does not have to pierce armor to influence a battle. It only has to change what people believe the battle means. This is why the Holy Lance could become so closely linked to victory. Medieval warfare was not only a contest of tactics and numbers, it was a contest of interpretation. When armies fought, the result was rarely treated as random. Victory could be read as divine approval. Defeat could be read as punishment, testing, betrayal, or the consequence of sin. The battlefield was not merely a place where men died. It was a place where God's favor seemed, at least to those watching, to reveal itself. A relic entered that world as a powerful interpreter. If a ruler marched with a sacred object and won, the relic helped turn success into proof. The victory was no longer just the result of discipline, terrain, strategy, supplies, and luck. It could be told as confirmation that heaven had supported the ruler's cause. Chroniclers could remember it that way. Clergy could preach it that way. Subjects could repeat it that way. The event became more than an event. It became evidence. But evidence of this kind was never neutral. It was arranged by the winners. This is something we should keep in mind whenever we hear that a medieval relic brought victory. The claim may reveal less about supernatural intervention than about how power explained itself after surviving a crisis. A king who wins with the spear nearby gains a story stronger than any battlefield report. A king who loses must find another explanation quickly, because relics associated with failure can become politically awkward companions. And yet, the belief was not simply propaganda imposed from above. Soldiers and ordinary people genuinely wanted signs. War was terrifying. Disease could kill before combat began. A poor decision by a noble commander could destroy thousands of lives. Most fighters had little control over the larger forces pushing them into danger. In such a world, the presence of a holy relic could offer psychological order. It could make fear feel contained inside a sacred plan. That matters, because morale is not decoration in war. It is part of war. An army that believes it is protected may endure longer. A ruler believed to be favored may command more loyalty. A frightened enemy may hesitate before attacking a force said to carry the weapon that touched Christ. Whether the relic possessed supernatural power is a theological question, but whether belief in the relic had worldly consequences is historical reality. Fear itself could become part of the relic's power. Not only the fear of being defeated, but the fear of opposing something sacred. If the spear was believed to signal divine permission, then facing the ruler who possessed it meant facing more than soldiers. It meant entering a moral drama in which one might already have been cast as the enemy of heaven's chosen order. That is a heavy burden to place on the mind before battle. Of course, not every opponent would accept the story. Rival rulers had their own relics, their own priests, their own claims of divine favor. Medieval Europe was not a stage where one side held all the symbols and everyone else surrendered in awe. Sacred legitimacy was contested constantly. One king's holy sign could be another king's superstition, theft, fraud, or political theater. Still, the contest itself proves the point. Powerful people did not ignore symbols. They fought over them, answered them, copied them, and tried to outshine them. If a relic could be dismissed easily, it would not need to be rivaled. The effort to claim divine approval was widespread because the language of divine approval was politically useful. The spear's battlefield meaning rested on a simple but potent chain of thought. Christ was pierced by the spear. The spear survived as a sacred sign. The ruler possesses the spear. Therefore, the ruler stands under special protection. Each link could be questioned. Each link depended on tradition, ceremony, and interpretation. But once the chain was accepted, it became difficult to break in public. A victory made the chain gleam. That is why rulers treasured moments when sacred objects and military success could be joined. They gave history a shape that people could remember. A complicated campaign became a story of holy favor. A messy political conflict became a contest between rightful order and rebellion. A ruler with many flaws became, at least for a while, the man whom God had allowed to triumph. The phrase, divine permission, is important here. The spear did not necessarily make every ruler appear saintly. Medieval subjects knew rulers could be cruel, greedy, foolish, and vain. But sacred victory did not require moral perfection. It required the impression that God, for reasons perhaps beyond human understanding, had permitted this ruler to prevail. That was enough to strengthen authority. Permission can be more useful than love. People may not love a ruler. They may resent taxes, fear soldiers, distrust courts, and mutter behind doors. But if they believe resistance stands against a divine arrangement, even a temporary one, their obedience may deepen. Sacred fear can achieve what admiration cannot. This is the darker side of relic power. It could inspire courage and devotion. It could also discipline imagination. It taught people not only what to hope for, but what to fear. A relic tied to victory made politics feel like theology. It made opposition feel dangerous in more than one world. And yet the spear's battlefield power remained fragile in a way all symbols are fragile. It depended on continued belief. Too many defeats, too many rival claims, too much obvious manipulation, and the aura could weaken. Sacred objects were powerful, but they were not immune to history. They had to keep being explained, honored, and successfully placed inside events that made their meaning believable. The spear did not conquer by itself. It conquered through interpretation. It turned victory into blessing, fear into obedience, and possession into permission. Its sharpest edge was not metal. It was the story told after the battle, when survivors searched the field for meaning and found, waiting above the blood and broken banners, the old claim that heaven had chosen a side. At some point, the spell breaks a little. Not completely. Not enough to erase the story, but enough for a careful mind to step back from the gold, the processions, the imperial claims, and ask a plain question. Which spear are we actually talking about? That question is simple only on the surface. The deeper we follow it, the more the Holy Lance becomes less like a single object with a clean biography and more like a cluster of traditions, claims, memories, and political needs. Different places claimed versions of the lance. Different rulers attached themselves to its power. Different communities preserved different stories, and the distance between the crucifixion and the medieval relics is long enough to make certainty difficult. This does not mean every claim was invented with cynical intent. Fraud existed in the medieval world, as it exists in every age, but not every uncertain relic began as a deliberate lie. Sometimes memory attached itself to an object gradually. Sometimes local tradition became stronger than documentation. Sometimes a relic's importance grew because generations had venerated it, not because anyone could produce a perfect chain of custody back to Jerusalem. Modern authenticity asks for provenance, material analysis, dates, and documentation. Medieval authenticity often asked different questions. Had the object been honored by the church? Had miracles or victories been associated with it? Had respected rulers guarded it? Had generations approached it in prayer? Had it become woven into the sacred life of a community? These were not trivial questions in that world. They were ways of measuring truth through continuity, authority, and devotion rather than laboratory certainty. But for us, the gaps matter. The biblical account gives us the piercing of Christ's side, but it does not preserve the spear as an identifiable artifact. The soldier is unnamed in the Gospel. The later name Longinus belongs to tradition. The transformation of the weapon into a relic unfolds through layers of Christian memory. By the time medieval rulers claimed sacred authority through the lance, the story had traveled through centuries of interpretation. That long journey invites caution. A relic can be meaningful without being historically verifiable in the way we might wish. Those two facts can exist together. The Holy Lance may have shaped empires even if its physical origin remains uncertain. In fact, that tension is one of the most revealing things about it. Its political power did not depend on satisfying modern standards of proof. It depended on the ability of a community, a court, or an empire to make the object believable within its own world. This is where the problem of authenticity becomes more than a technical issue. It becomes a window into medieval authority. If a ruler possessed a relic believed to be the true lance, he gained symbolic force. If another center claimed a rival lance, the dispute was not only about metal, it was about whose memory counted. Who had the right to locate sacred history? Who could say, "Here is the object that touched the passion"? Who could draw pilgrims, command reverence, and build political legitimacy around that claim? Authenticity, then, was also a struggle over control. The evidence is thinner than the legends want it to be. That should be said plainly. The more confidently a tradition claims an unbroken line from Golgotha to a medieval treasury, the more carefully we should examine the silence between the links. Sacred objects often acquire certainty in retelling. A cautious, Believed to be becomes, after enough ceremonies, almost indistinguishable from known to be. Ceremony can harden a possibility into a public fact, yet dismissing the relics as simple fakes would miss the more interesting truth. The Holy Lance mattered because people lived inside stories where sacred objects could mediate between heaven and earth. A relic's authority was not built only by its origin. It was built by use. Every procession, oath, legend, victory, and act of veneration added another layer. The object became historical not merely because of where it came from, but because of what it caused people to do. That is a different kind of history, but it is still history. The question, was it real, remains important. It guards us against being seduced by imperial theater. It reminds us that power often dresses uncertainty in sacred clothing. It prevents us from treating medieval claims as transparent fact simply because they were repeated with confidence. But another question must stand beside it. What did belief in its reality make possible? It made kings appear chosen. It made battles look like verdicts. It made fragile dynasties feel attached to eternal events. It allowed empire to present itself not as an accident of violence, but as the continuation of a sacred order. A forged relic could still shape a real coronation. An uncertain object could still inspire real fear. A doubtful tradition could still help build a real empire. That is the uncomfortable lesson of the Holy Lance. Historical proof and historical power are not the same thing. Sometimes an object becomes powerful precisely because it sits in the space between evidence and desire. Too much certainty might reduce it to an artifact. Too much doubt might destroy it. But uncertainty, managed through ritual, can become fertile ground for myth. The medieval world was not blind to this. Doubt existed. Rival claims existed. Church authorities sometimes investigated relics, questioned them, moved them, defended them, or quietly allowed devotion to continue. The sacred marketplace was crowded, and not every claim could be equally strong. Still, people often preferred a meaningful uncertainty to a meaningless absence. The lance offered contact. Even disputed contact was better than distance. For believers, it brought the passion close. For rulers, it brought heaven close to the throne. For cities and treasuries, it brought prestige. For chroniclers, it gave history a dramatic center. For later generations, it became a symbol onto which new fears and ambitions could be projected. So the problem of authenticity does not end the story. It deepens it. Because the Holy Lance shows us that power does not always require proof in order to operate. It requires a world willing to act as if the proof has already been given. And in medieval Europe, where politics, worship, memory, and fear were bound tightly together, that willingness could turn a contested piece of iron into a sign before which emperors bowed. The mystery is not only whether any surviving lance is the true one. The mystery is how much of Europe's political imagination was built around the need for it to be true. Medieval Europe needed the spear because medieval Europe was rarely as solid as it wanted to appear. The maps may look clean when we see them centuries later, colored in blocks, labeled with dynasties and kingdoms, as though authority sat neatly inside borders. But the lived reality was far more nervous. Power was personal, succession was dangerous, loyalty was negotiated. A ruler could be crowned and still spend years proving that the crown had truly settled on his head. A dynasty might look ancient in its own propaganda and fragile in its private letters. This is the world that gave symbols their urgency. Kings and emperors did not rule over calm machines of state. They ruled over layered societies held together by oath, land, marriage, inheritance, fear, custom, and the church. A noble might kneel today and rebel next year. A brother might become a claimant. A bishop might bless a ruler's authority or complicate it. A military defeat could make old doubts suddenly brave. In such a world, legitimacy had to be renewed constantly. It was not enough to possess power. Power had to be narrated. The spear helped provide that narration. It told a story simple enough to be understood and grand enough to be believed. The ruler who held this sacred weapon was not merely fortunate, not merely violent, not merely first among ambitious men. He stood within a chain that reached from the passion of Christ to the mission of Christian empire. That chain did a great deal of work. It connected a temporary ruler to eternal history. It connected local struggles to universal meaning. It connected the violence of kingship to the suffering of Christ. A connection that could inspire reverence, unease, or both. Most importantly, it allowed political authority to present itself as something more than human arrangement. This was essential because medieval politics was full of arrangements. Marriages arranged alliances. Electors arranged successions. Lords arranged loyalties. Bishops arranged ceremonies. Armies arranged outcomes with less grace. Everyone knew, at some level, that power was built through human decisions. Sacred symbols helped cover that human machinery with a larger pattern. They did not make politics disappear. They made politics feel providential. The Church's influence made this even more important. No medieval ruler could entirely ignore the religious imagination of his subjects. The Church controlled not only rituals of salvation, but much of the language through which people understood authority, sin, justice, and cosmic order. A king who wished to rule well, or at least appear to rule legitimately, needed some relationship with sacred approval. That relationship could be cooperative, tense, or openly hostile. Kings and churchmen did not always agree, and the history of medieval Europe is filled with struggles between spiritual and temporal power. But even conflict with the Church proved its importance. Rulers fought with popes and bishops because religious authority mattered enough to fight over. The spear stood at that intersection. It was useful to rulers because it did not belong only to the Church or only to the battlefield. It could move between them. It could be blessed, displayed, guarded, and interpreted. It could appear in a treasury and still suggest a campaign. It could carry the memory of Christ's passion and still strengthen an emperor's hand. It was exactly the kind of object a fractured world could use. Sacred enough for devotion, martial enough for kings, ancient enough for empire. Europe needed such objects because legitimacy was vulnerable. A ruler might claim descent, but another family might claim better descent. He might claim conquest, but conquest alone could make him look like a usurper. He might claim election, but elections could be disputed. He might claim papal favor, but papal favor could shift. The spear offered a different kind of claim, harder to argue with in public, because it spoke through reverence rather than paperwork. This did not mean everyone accepted it without question, but symbols do not require universal belief to be effective. They only need enough public recognition to shape the terms of debate. If a ruler's enemies had to explain why his sacred relic did not prove divine favor, the relic had already forced them to answer its story. That is political power, not silence, not certainty. Framing. The spear framed the ruler as chosen, or at least as plausibly chosen. It framed victory as confirmation. It framed continuity with Rome as sacred inheritance rather than nostalgia. It framed rebellion as spiritually dangerous. In a world where the fear of disorder was deep and constant, that framing could matter as much as law. We should also remember the emotional needs beneath the political ones. Medieval Europe was not only unstable at the top. Ordinary people lived with war, famine, disease, local violence, sudden death, and limited control over decisions made far above them. Sacred symbols gave shape to uncertainty. They suggested that history was not merely a series of accidents and ambitions, but a drama held within divine knowledge. That belief could comfort. It could also be used. The Holy Lance sat exactly on that line between consolation and control. For the devout, it brought the passion close. For rulers, it made authority glow with borrowed holiness. For soldiers, it promised protection. For enemies, it threatened divine judgment. For chroniclers, it made history easier to arrange into meaning. Europe needed the spear because Europe needed stories strong enough to survive contradiction. It needed to believe that broken kingdoms belonged to a sacred order. It needed to believe that violent rulers could be defenders of peace. It needed to believe that the old Roman dream had not died, but had been carried forward under Christian signs. It needed to believe that the chaos of succession, war, and ambition could be gathered around an object and made legible. The spear did not solve Europe's instability. It gave instability a sacred explanation. That may sound like a small difference, but it is not. People can endure great uncertainty if they believe it has meaning. They can obey flawed rulers if they believe those rulers stand within a divine order. They can march into danger if they believe history has already tilted toward their side. The spear was powerful because it helped make those beliefs feel visible. It was a weapon, a relic, an inheritance, and a warning. It did not need to be swung. It needed to be believed. In a Europe of fragile dynasties, constant warfare, and competing sacred authorities, that belief could become more useful than iron. Because iron can win a battle. A symbol can explain why the battle had to be won. A relic begins with a claim of contact. This touched the holy. This came near the wound. This carries the memory of a sacred event. But an imperial myth begins when that claim stops belonging only to devotion and starts organizing the story of power itself. The Holy Lance crossed that line slowly. It was not transformed in a single ceremony, nor by a single ruler deciding to make it useful. Its meaning accumulated across generations as courts, churches, chroniclers, and treasuries placed it again and again inside the language of empire. At first glance, myth may sound like a polite word for falsehood. That is not the sense that matters here. A myth in political life is a story that gives power a shape people can inhabit. It tells a community where authority comes from, why obedience matters, what the past demands, and who has the right to continue it. Myths can contain facts. They can also contain distortions, omissions, exaggerations, and convenient silences. Their force lies not in being simple fiction, but in becoming a framework through which events are understood. The Holy Lance became such a framework. It allowed European rulers to imagine power as a chain of inheritance. First came Rome, the empire of law, conquest, and universal ambition. Then came Christianity, the faith that transformed the symbols of suffering into the language of salvation. Then came the medieval emperor, who could claim to stand where those two mighty streams met. The spear helped bind them together in a single image. Rome provided the grammar of command. Christianity provided the grammar of sanctity. Empire needed both. Without Rome, a medieval ruler might be only local, however strong. Without Christianity, he might be only forceful, however successful. But by claiming the legacy of Rome under the sign of Christ, imperial power could present itself as more than domination. It could present itself as mission. That word matters. Mission gives ambition a clean face. It allows expansion to sound like duty, hierarchy to sound like order, and victory to sound like confirmation. The spear's legend helped make that conversion possible. A weapon once associated with the death of Christ could become, in imperial imagination, a sign that Christian rulers had inherited not merely Roman territory or Roman titles, but Roman destiny purified by faith. The legend did not erase contradiction. It depended on it. The spear was powerful because it held incompatible meanings without resolving them. It was Roman and Christian, violent and holy, humiliating and triumphant, a sign of death and a sign of rule. Such contradictions might weaken a legal argument, but they often strengthen a myth. They give it depth. They allow different audiences to see different truths inside the same object. A monk could see the passion. A soldier could see victory. A king could see legitimacy. An emperor could see Rome. That range made the spear unusually durable. It could be placed into devotional settings without losing political charge. It could be placed into imperial settings without losing sacred aura. It belonged to no single meaning completely, which meant it could survive changes in ruler, dynasty, and political crisis. Over time, the story became larger than the object. That is the decisive step in the making of imperial myth. The spearhead itself, whether authentic, disputed, repaired, embellished, or reinterpreted, became less important than the role it played in the imagination of authority. People did not need to know every detail of its material history to understand the claims surrounding it. The emperor who possessed the spear stood in a sacred line. That was the message, and messages repeated in ceremony can become political reality. A coronation is, in one sense, a performance. A procession is a performance. A treasury display is a performance. But performances are not unreal simply because they are staged. They create public facts. They teach people how to see. They turn a man into a ruler into an heir, and an heir into the living continuation of an ancient mission. The spear helped stage that transformation. It did so by making history feel continuous. This was crucial because real history was full of rupture. Rome had changed beyond recognition. Christian kingdoms fought one another. Emperors clashed with popes. Dynasties failed. Borders moved. Claims contradicted claims. Yet the myth of the spear could smooth those breaks into a single line, from the crucifixion to Christian empire. From Roman authority to medieval rule, from sacred wound to imperial mission. This smoothing was not innocent. Myths often heal the past by hiding its fractures. The empire that crucified Christ and the empire that claimed to defend Christ were not the same thing. The path between them was not straight. The rulers who invoked sacred symbols were often as political, ambitious, and compromised as rulers anywhere. But the spear offered a way to tell the story beautifully enough that the fractures seemed less threatening. That beauty was part of its power. Not beauty in the gentle sense, but in the severe architecture of meaning. A single object could gather centuries into one gesture. It could allow an emperor to appear not as a temporary victor in a messy world, but as the bearer of a role older than himself. It made power feel inherited from the deepest past and answerable to the highest authority. And because the myth was imperial, it was never only about one ruler. It was about the office. The body of the emperor would fail. His judgment might fail. His heirs might fail. But the myth could continue. The spear could wait in the treasury. The regalia could be brought out again. A new ruler could step into the same story, and the old symbols could make him look less new. This is one reason political myths are so effective. They outlive the individuals who benefit from them. The Holy Lance's journey from relic to myth reveals something uncomfortable about European power. Authority often wanted to appear historical and heavenly at the same time. It wanted to say, "I come from the past," and also, "I am approved by eternity." The spear allowed both claims to touch. Whether it truly touched Christ's side remains a matter of disputed tradition, but it certainly touched the imagination of empire. And in politics, imagination is not a soft thing. It can move armies, quiet doubts, justify laws, sanctify violence, and persuade generations that one throne carries more meaning than another. The Holy Lance became an imperial myth because it gave power a story grand enough to hide its human construction. It made rule look ancient. It made conquest look ordained. It made the emperor look less like a man holding office and more like the final link in a chain forged from Rome, blood, faith, and memory. That was the myth. And for centuries, myth was enough to make men kneel. By now, the central question has changed. At the beginning, it seems natural to ask whether the spear had power, whether it protected armies, whether it chose emperors, whether it carried some supernatural force from the wound of Christ into the hands of Europe's rulers. But history rarely gives us clean answers to questions shaped like legends. What we can say with more confidence is this: the spear had power because people built a world in which it could have power. Priests gave it language. Rulers gave it a stage. Chroniclers gave it memory. Soldiers gave it fear. Crowds gave it recognition. And once all of these forces gathered around the object, the spear no longer needed to prove itself in the way a modern skeptic might demand. It had already become real in its consequences. This is the key to understanding sacred political symbols. Their power does not always lie in what they physically are. It lies in what they allow people to do, believe, fear, and obey. A relic can shape history without being what later tradition claims it to be. A symbol can move a kingdom even when its origin remains uncertain. A weapon can rule without ever being raised in battle. The Holy Lance was one of those weapons. Its true edge was not iron. It was belief. Belief can be gentle. It can comfort the frightened, give meaning to grief, and bind a community together across generations. But belief can also harden into obedience. It can make hierarchy feel natural, victory feel deserved, and violence feel cleansed by purpose. The spear stood at that dangerous intersection. It pointed toward the suffering of Christ, but it also strengthened the hands of rulers who wanted their commands to seem sealed by heaven. That does not make the people who revered it foolish. It makes them human. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where the sacred was not sealed away from politics. Heaven was not an abstract doctrine reserved for private thought. It was part of law, war, birth, death, kingship, illness, weather, and fate. To ask whether a ruler was legitimate was not only to ask who had the strongest army or the clearest inheritance. It was also to ask where that ruler stood in the moral order of the universe. The spear helped answer that question visually. A man beside the spear could appear chosen. A dynasty guarding the spear could appear protected. An empire claiming the spear could appear inherited from Rome and approved by Christ. None of this required perfect evidence. In fact, the uncertainty may have made the symbol more flexible. A fully documented object can be studied, dated, and placed in a narrow frame. A legendary relic can grow. It can absorb victories, survive contradictions, and take on meanings that no single artifact could carry alone. The spear's strength came from that accumulation. It gathered the Roman habit of symbols, the Christian memory of the Passion, the medieval hunger for sacred kingship, and the imperial dream of continuity. It became a meeting point where armies, priests, rulers, and ordinary people could look and see different things that still supported the same structure of authority. The soldier saw protection. The priest saw sacred history. The emperor saw legitimacy. The enemy saw warning. The historian, looking back, sees a machine of meaning, and perhaps that is the most honest way to speak of its power. Not as a magic object proving heaven's endorsement of one ruler over another, but as an instrument through which societies made that endorsement imaginable. The spear did not have to open the sky. It only had to persuade people that the sky had already spoken. This is why the relic could survive doubt. Questions about authenticity mattered, but they did not fully destroy the story. Rival claims mattered, but they did not erase the need for the symbol. Political manipulation mattered, but it did not cancel sincere devotion. The spear endured because it answered a deep problem of authority. How can earthly power, so visibly human and often so violent, be made to feel sacred? The answer was not found in the metal alone. It was found in the world around the metal, in the procession, in the treasury, in the chronicler's sentence, in the bishop's blessing, in the nervous silence before battle, in the public memory of victory, in the fear that opposing the ruler might mean opposing more than a ruler. That is the true power of the spear. It turned belief into structure. It turned uncertainty into authority. It turned a wound into a political language. And from that language, emperors learned one of the oldest lessons in history. A throne is strongest when people believe it stands not only on the earth, but under heaven. In the end, the Holy Lance was never only a spear. It was a way of telling history. A piece of iron, real or disputed, could not by itself rebuild Rome, sanctify conquest, settle succession crises, or make frightened soldiers believe that heaven marched beside them. The object mattered, but the story around it mattered more. Without that story, it was metal. With that story, it became a weapon of destiny. And that story was carefully layered. It began with the wound at Golgotha, where a Roman act of execution entered Christian memory. It passed through a world that understood symbols as instruments of command. It grew in an empire that had become Christian, where the objects of the passion could move from devotion into politics. It survived the fall of Western Rome because new rulers still needed Rome's shadow, and they needed Christianity's blessing even more. By the time the spear stood in imperial imagination, it no longer pointed only backward to Christ's side. It pointed outward, toward Europe's argument over legitimacy. Who had the right to rule? Who inherited Rome? Who defended Christendom? Who could claim that victory was not merely success, but permission? The spear gave those questions a shape. That is why it unsettles us. It reveals something about power that has never belonged only to the Middle Ages. Authority does not live by armies and laws alone. It needs images, it needs ceremonies, it needs inherited words, sacred places, public memory, and objects that make people feel history has weight. A throne is easier to challenge when it looks like furniture. It is harder to challenge when it appears to stand at the end of a divine story. This does not prove the spear was authentic. It proves that authenticity was never the whole of its power. The true weapon was the narrative built around it. A narrative strong enough to make emperors seem chosen, strong enough to turn relics into political machines, strong enough to let violence wear the clothing of sacred duty. That story could comfort believers, inspire armies, and give order to a fractured world. It could also make domination look inevitable. That double edge is the reason the Holy Lance remains fascinating. It is both a relic of devotion and a warning about belief. It reminds us that symbols can gather hope, fear, loyalty, and ambition into one visible form. And when enough people agree to see authority inside that form, the symbol begins to act in history, not magically, socially, politically, spiritually, humanly. The weapon of destiny was not only a spearhead preserved in a treasury or claimed by rival traditions. It was the grand imperial story that wrapped itself around the spear, century after century, until the object and the myth could barely be separated. And perhaps that is the final lesson. In European history, the ruler who controlled the army could seize a throne, but the ruler who controlled the symbol could make the throne seem chosen.